We've got somebody back whom we've had speak for us many times, like our previous speaker, Professor John Wyatt, who I think has been here almost every summer course, I think, over the past few years. John is Emeritus Professor of Ethics and Perinatology at University College in London. He has a clinical background. He was very much involved in the perinatology unit there at University College, which is certainly the most advanced, I think, in Britain, and has incredible experience of life at both the beginning and end of life. So life and death, and that's what our topic is about this morning. What does it mean to be a person? Matters of life and death. So thanks very much, John.
Thanks very much, Dennis. It's a great privilege to be able to talk. I very much enjoy speaking here at these courses, and look forward to the discussion and debate. As Gareth Jones said earlier, of course, these are highly complex, contentious, difficult issues, and I certainly have no simple or knockdown solution. As you heard, I've recently become an emeritus professor at UCL, and the rector of the church I attend in London, John Stott, when he became rector emeritus, people used to ask him what emeritus meant, and he always used to say with great solemnity, well, he said, it's derived from two Latin words, e or ex, meaning out of it, and meritus, meaning and deservedly so. So that's how I feel. So I spent most of my life actually as a clinician working in a very sophisticated area of medicine and neonatal intensive care unit, and caring for extremely small and vulnerable little babies. And this is a shot taken on the unit where I worked for many years. And one of the problems in a neonatal intensive care unit is actually to find the patient. Somewhere in the middle of that, there is a patient. That's actually the baby's head, and that's the baby's body. And everything else is the technology which is keeping alive a tiny little baby, in this case born at 25 or 26 weeks gestation, weighing perhaps 600 or 700 grams, and dependent from minute to minute on very sophisticated technology and biophysical techniques and medical and nursing care just to stay alive. And it's a highly expensive, invasive sort of medicine. It costs, by current figures, something like £1,500 per baby per day in the UK, and the total cost of caring for one of these tiny little babies would be as much as maybe £100,000. In the UK, all paid for entirely by the National Health Service, by the state. And there's something like 120 health professionals on the neonatal intensive care unit, and a huge investment and resources goes into caring for these little lives. And clearly, we as a society are saying that this little life has some intrinsic value, that it's a being of significance, it's a being worth investing huge sums of money in. And supporting parents and families with the stress of having a little baby is extremely demanding. Actually, that's my hand and one of the babies, just to show the sort of scale. But just one floor away, in the same hospital, in the same National Health Service, is another very sophisticated area of medicine called the Fetal Medicine Unit, where pregnant mothers are referred from a wide area of southeast England and London. Detailed investigations are performed, particularly ultrasound, but now increasingly using other techniques, including fetal magnetic resonance imaging, scanning. This is the procedure of amniocentesis. Fluid is removed, amniotic fluid, and then analysed. And very frequently, this kind of karyotype, the chromosomes from an unborn fetus, an unborn baby, a fetus are obtained. We know that it's a little girl. She has 2 X chromosomes, but she has an additional 21 chromosomes, so trisomy 21. And we know that if this child survives, that she'll have Down syndrome. We don't know how severe it's going to be on the basis of the karyotype. It could be extremely severe with life-threatening abnormalities. It could be relatively minor, although nearly always associated with some degree of learning disorder, disability. I wonder if anybody would like to guess what percentage of parents in the UK at present, if if shown this karyotype, would then choose to have an abortion. They will always be offered the possibility of an abortion. Any guess on the percentage? 100%. 90? 95? You're in the right ballpark. It's about 92, actually, 92, 93% at present. And what is often not recognised is that the very procedure, the amniocentesis procedure, carries a significant risk of inducing a miscarriage of between 1 in 50 to 1 in 100. And therefore it's been estimated, and the figures are really quite robust, that between 1 in 2 and 1 in 4, well, for every one fetus who's diagnosed with Down syndrome, between 2 and 4 normal fetuses will die as a result of a miscarriage following the amniocentesis. So clearly here society is saying that it's more important that we detect one fetus with Down syndrome in order to offer a termination than these other 2 or 4 fetuses will survive. And in fact, the National Health Service has now rolled out a nationwide program called the Fetal Anomaly Screening Program, and is investing millions of pounds to try to ensure that as many fetuses as possible with some degree of abnormality are identified prior to birth, using a variety of different techniques, particularly early ultrasound scanning, using this thing, the nuchal fold measurement. So it's been discovered that in babies with a range of congenital anomalies, this thickness of this fetal structure, the nuchal fold, is increased, and therefore can be used as a screening tool in very early pregnancy. And if nuchal fold thickness is increased, then a range of other investigations, including invasive investigations, can be performed. And late ultrasound scanning is usually done at 18 to 21 weeks in order to try to detect fetal abnormalities. And sometimes, therefore, fetal abnormalities are not really diagnosed until 23, 24 weeks, sometimes later. In fact, what's become more problematic now is with the use of fetal magnetic resonance imaging scanning, brain abnormalities are being picked up at later and later gestational stages, including 30, 32, 34, 36 weeks gestation. And in the UK, it's legal for an abortion to be carried out at any stage up to term if there's a substantial risk of a significant handicap, and in the words of the Act. And therefore, in the hospital where I work, on a regular basis, although the numbers are small, but they do happen certainly every month, late feticides are carried out at 28 weeks, 30 weeks, 32 weeks, 36 weeks. And on a number of occasions, I've been called away from the neonatal intensive care unit, where we're struggling to save a tiny little preterm baby, to go one floor to the fetal medicine unit to talk to a pregnant woman who's considering having a termination. And the fetus in her womb is considerably bigger and more robust and more advanced than the baby that we're struggling to save one floor down. And you ask yourself, how is it possible in one hospital, in one health service, to have these apparently contradictory activities both going on? And that, of course, it's a very interesting and complex question. But at least part of it, I would contend, is due to the debate of what does it mean to be a person. Because in the field of neonatology, we very much treat this baby, at whatever gestational age, as a unique human individual. It's a person to be named, a person to be loved and cared for, a person even to be respected, treated with dignity. And that treatment is irrespective of whether the baby is wanted or not. One of the interesting things I've observed is that, although it doesn't happen very often, from time to time babies are abandoned on the baby unit, or the parents make it very clear that this is a baby that they don't want to survive. And very often in that situation, the reaction of the staff is paradoxically to treat this baby with greater care, and with greater love, and with greater sense of protection, precisely because this baby is unwanted. So whether or not this individual is wanted or not doesn't seem, in the world of neonatology, to influence our attitudes towards this being. But the being in the womb is treated not as a person. In the case of late feticide, it's treated as a potential person. And usually this being is not named and is not identified, and is not always, sometimes the parents would name the baby, but in general it's regarded as not a being that has an intrinsic value, it's a being that has a potential value. It's interesting that, just to sidestep to this whole industry which has now developed of fetal screening, that it, as a technological project, it has very much similar criteria as other technological projects. So it's devoted to efficiency, to obtaining as many bangs for your buck as possible, trying to screen as many as possible. It's cost effectiveness, quality control. So, for instance, the whole thinking of quality control, ensuring that there are uniform standards of fetal screening, that diagnostic errors are minimised, and so on, uniformity. So all these technological projects have similar criteria, even when they're basically orientated towards what some people have described as a search and destroy mission, an attempt to identify abnormal developing human beings in order that they can be offered to parents the prospect of termination. This is a graph from an official report showing that the blue line shows the number of diagnoses of Down syndrome taking place over 15 years, and the red dotted line shows the number of live births that there would have been of children with Down syndrome if there had been no antenatal screening, whereas the green line shows the number of live births with Down syndrome there had in actual fact been. And therefore this is used to show the fact that the antenatal screening program is being effective. More babies are being diagnosed with Down syndrome and are being aborted. And so that gap represents the children with Down syndrome who would have been born and who would be part of our society, but who are missing because of antenatal screening. And some philosophers have gone on further and have said that in fact if a mother knows that there is an abnormality of the fetus that is serious and is going to cause suffering, then in some sense there is a duty to have an abortion, that a responsible parent would have an abortion. There is some kind of moral duty. So here very much the concept is that this being in the womb is a being that only has potentiality, and that if it seems that that potentiality is impaired because of a genetic abnormality, because of some other fetal malformation, then the destruction of this being is not the destruction of an intrinsic, another person. And of course what seems to happen is as our technology and our means of screening increase, they lead to a sense of responsibility. And what we're now able to get through the use of technology in the antenatal period is a sort of godlike knowledge, a sort of knowledge which only was previously available to the deity. But along with that knowledge then comes this terrible crushing sense of responsibility. And I've been involved in many hundreds of conversations with parents, and very often it's around the question of what is the responsible thing to do in this situation. And of course, again, there is no easy answer to that question. It's about to get a whole lot worse, more difficult, because of the development of what's now called non-invasive prenatal diagnosis. So it turns out that during pregnancy, small amounts of fetal DNA are circulating in the mother's circulation, so-called free fetal DNA. And this DNA can now be isolated using PCR techniques and analysed. And this technique is now already becoming available clinically. So it means simply by having a blood test during pregnancy, during early pregnancy, an extremely detailed, potentially the entire genome can be obtained from a blood test from the entire fetal genome. And it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see the sort of dilemmas which may well be given in the future. So the pregnant woman has a blood test and is then told, well, we've worked out that you've got a little girl and she has a 60% chance of having breast cancer before the age of 55 and 70% chance of Alzheimer's before the age of 70 and significant risk of type 2 diabetes. Now, do you think it's the right thing to bring this child into the world? Would that be a loving thing to do? Or would it be better to try and have another child? So the potential for dilemmas and agonies for the future, I think, will only increase. It's already being used for paternity. You can already on the internet send off, a pregnant woman can send off a blood sample together with a putative sample from the putative father, and then get the test as to whether or not this is. Do you like this toll-free number? 1877 RUI So you can see the potential here for complications. And it's already being used in a number of places for sex selection, and not just PGD sex selection, but various other techniques as well. Free fetal DNA can also be used for sex selection. As Gareth Jones just mentioned earlier, The Sun is, for those of you who aren't Brits, The Sun is a tabloid newspaper which is well known for the very high quality and sophisticated nature of the ethical argumentation. So, I like this headline: "Slaughter newborn kids," say academics. And as Gareth mentioned, this was a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. Sorry, no, the Journal of Medical Ethics, which was called "After Birth Abortion: Why Should the Baby Live?" And they were based on arguments which we're going to look at, that basically not just the fetus, but also the newborn baby can be regarded as a person, and therefore any argument which defends late abortion can also be used to defend infanticide. It's not just at the beginning of life that the debate about what the person goes on, and again, the discussion we had before the break, there is also the debate at the end of life. So in the UK here, there's been a lot of publicity to a man called Tony Nicholson, who has a tragic syndrome called locked-in syndrome, where there's a major hemorrhagic stroke in the brain, which has the effect of wiping out all possibility of motor connections, whereas sensory connections and processing, cortical cognitive processing, remains intact. And so you end up with somebody who is locked inside the body, but who is conscious and who is aware of what's going on. And if you want to get a sense of what this condition is like, can I recommend to you a book and a film called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly? It's a wonderful film and a wonderful book by a man who was in France, who was a well-known editor of a fashion magazine, and he, out of the blue, had this devastating stroke, and he wakes up in hospital, and he discovers the only way of communicating is by blinking one eyelid. And he manages to develop, with a speech therapist, he manages to develop a means of communication where he can spell out the letters of the alphabet. And eventually he writes an entire book. The book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, is written first person by this chap, simply by blinking. And it's an extraordinary, moving account of finding himself. And the diving bell is his body, in which he's trapped. And the butterfly is his mind, which is flying free. And it's an extraordinary, powerful insight into the condition. Tony Nicholson is arguing that it's human right to be killed. He says his life is miserable. demeaning and undignified, and he can't kill himself because he has no motor activity, and he's therefore demanding the right to be killed by Dr. And we've had a whole series of high-profile cases in the media. This is the case last year of a brain-damaged woman who was close to the condition of persistent vegetative state, but in fact had some evidence of conscious awareness. But the question was it right to withdraw feeding hydration in this woman who didn't meet the criteria for persistent vegetative state? And again, a big nationwide debate about this. And so part of the question again is, can these people in these borderline states be regarded as being a person? Or are they a post-person? Have they ceased to be a person? Are they effectively dead in a living body? Has the person died and gone? And the same issue is often raised about the problem of dementia. Many parents, many children who watch their parents develop dementia and go through this whole program, in the end, I've heard them say to me something like that: "That's not my mother. My mother died some years ago. That's somebody else." So the implication being that the person is gone, that the effect of this kind of degenerative condition is to mean that personhood is lost. And in the UK, we have a very active pro-euthanasia movement. It used to be called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. The Voluntary Euthanasia Society was a fairly dodgy, disreputable organisation which used to recommend encourage people how they could hoard tablets and kill themselves with polythene bags and so on. And they've had a complete makeover, and they've changed their name. And notice the name change is highly significant. It's now called Dignity in Dying. And it's now become an extremely sophisticated, professional, highly funded, and very well supported organisation, which has very close links with the media, and it's actually constantly feeding the stories into the newspaper. So the reason that there is almost every week you get banner headlines of some new tragic case, this didn't happen by chance. It's actually because this organisation is feeding these stories, and they have willing allies in the media who want to keep promoting this, with the goal being to change the law to allow physician-assisted suicide and ultimately medical killing, intentional medical killing, euthanasia. And it's very interesting to see how the language has changed. So in the 1990s, there was a big debate going on in euthanasia in the UK. And then the debate was nearly entirely about suffering. It was about people in agony. And the sort of language was used is, you wouldn't allow a dog to die like that. Surely you should kill people to put them out of their misery. And the diseases in focus were largely cancer. It was disseminated cancer causing terrible, excruciating pain. And there was the tragic cases coming in the media, and surely the right thing to do was to allow euthanasia. After a lot of debate, Parliament decided decisively that they would not recommend euthanasia, and the debate went quiet for a few years. For the last 5 years or so, it has raged again, but it's interesting to see how it's changed. Now, the debate is not at all about pain. It's entirely about dignity and about dependence, and my right to control my life, my right to choose when I die. And the diseases in focus are not cancer. The diseases in focus are neurodegenerative conditions, such as motor neuron disease, or spinal muscular atrophy, or spinal cord damage, dementia, and so on. These are diseases which don't cause severe physical pain, but they cause dependence. And therefore the argument goes that I no longer have the right to kill myself, and therefore I have the right to be assisted to die, to be killed. And it's just interesting to see these words: choice, control, a dignified death for all, patient choice at the end of life, and so on. So underlying these questions then is what is a person, and a group of philosophers coming primarily from the utilitarian, secular utilitarian position, have promoted a definition of personhood. So Peter Singer, this is the definition he used, is a being who has a capacity for self-awareness and for making choices. So two things, and particularly he emphasises making choices. And so he's what often is called a preference utilitarian. It's the preferences, it's my autonomous choices, which are ultimately the single most important thing in my life. They are what validate me as a person, the fact that I make choices. And therefore the ability to make choices, to exercise my preference, and in particular, to exercise a preference that I want to carry on living, is what makes me a person. John Harris has a similar but slightly different definition. He says it's a being who is capable of valuing their own existence. The value of my life is precisely the value I give to my own life. So, if I value my life, then my life is worthwhile. If I don't value my life is not worthwhile. If I can't value my life because I don't even know I exist, then clearly my life doesn't have value. And Michael Tooley uses this concept of a continuing self. A person is a being who is capable of understanding that they have a continuing self. If you are not aware that you exist, you do not have an automatic right to life. And so these group of philosophers would say that the question of whether or not you are aware of your own existence, whether or not you are aware that you are a continuing self, is an empirical question. It's a question that can be answered by psychologists, and it's not a moral question. And it is interesting. It's generally said that somewhere between 1 to 2 years is where the first glimmerings of self-awareness become apparent, and there are a number of psychological tests that can be performed in order to identify whether an infant has some kind of concept of itself. But I was reading recently about this concept of the continuing self, and interestingly, it's generally thought that the continuing self, the idea that I am the same person as that I was last year, and who I will be next year, that's really a very sophisticated concept. And some psychologists feel it really doesn't become stable until about 3 to 4 years of age. So that if you were to take Tooley's concept of the continuing self, you come to the conclusion that children who are less than, say, 3 don't really qualify as having a robust understanding that they are an individual continuing in time. As Singer goes on, only a person can want to go on living or have plans for the future because only a person can understand the possibility of a future existence. So this is again this idea, I understand that I have a future existence. This means that to end the life of people against their will is different from ending the lives of beings who are not people. Killing a person against his or her will is a much more serious wrong than killing a being who is not a person. So in other words, Singer argues that the moral evil of homicide, of the destruction of a human life, is the evil of taking away the life that you know you're going to have. And therefore that loss to my preferences, that obstruction of my preferences is the fundamental moral evil in homicide. Now, of course, this does lead to various problems, which have been much debated in the literature, and the most obvious one is if I'm fast asleep and someone steals into my room and painlessly kills me so that I never wake up, have they done a moral evil to me since I never knew that I had lost future years? Or, for instance, in an anaesthetic, if I'm deeply unconscious during an anaesthetic, I lose all self-awareness, and then I'm killed. Is that the same as a crime which is committed while I am fully awake and aware of what is happening to me? Of course, again, this is well known. Singer goes on and says there are many non-human animals whose rationality, self-consciousness, awareness, capacity to feel, and so on exceed that of a human baby, a week, a month, or even a year old. An adult chimpanzee has more right to be described as a person than a newborn baby. And so Singer has then invented the moral evil of speciesism. So he says that ageism is to make moral discriminations on the basis of age, and sexism, racism, and so on. These are all immoral to make these distinctions, because you're making distinctions on characteristics which are not morally significant. Why should someone's gender, their age, their race be morally significant? But he goes on and says, but your species is not morally significant either. So speciesism is to discriminate on the basis of species, and that's as much a moral evil as ageism or sexism. I think it's important to point out that there are serious philosophical problems with this idea of the person as the autonomous self. And before we get into look at some of the theological and religious perspectives, the first is that effectively what Singer has done is he has replaced discrimination on the basis of species with discrimination on the basis of cortical function. So he says you have to have a certain amount of cortical function in order to have a life that is worth living. And he says a chimpanzee has got that cortical function, etc. Even a dog has that cortical function. A fetus doesn't have that cortical function. Therefore, we can discriminate morally. But he's simply replaced one form of discrimination by another. Why? And you could call him a corticalist. If he calls me a speciesist, I will call him a corticalist. And it's not at all obvious why corticalism, why discrimination on the basis of cortical function, should be more moral than speciesism, discrimination on the basis of species membership. Secondly, there's a huge problem I see here, which is a fascinating one, which has really had very little exposure, I think, in the philosophical literature, and I think it would benefit from having much greater philosophical exposure. So the whole essence of Singer's approach and of those philosophers, it's profoundly dualistic. In other words, I, the choosing self, am making choices about my body. I am deciding whether my body should live or die. I am deciding what to do with my body. So in other words, it's a profoundly dualistic. There is the I, the conscious choosing self, acting on my body. But, Peter Singer, what is this I, this conscious choosing self? What is it? Well, the neuroscientific consensus is that the I is merely an epiphenomenon created by neuronal functioning. There is no conscious self. There is no such thing. There is just matter and stuff within a secular scientific materialist perspective. So in other words, it's simply neuronal functioning which is determining neuronal functioning. That whole concept of the autonomous choosing self is profoundly incoherent when matched against the neuroscientific monism, the fact that there is nothing but the brain and brain stuff. So I think there is a profound incoherence there. Thirdly, there's the problem of contingency. So as I stand here, I am a person, I have rights, I can choose, I can direct my life. But all of a sudden, a small clot emanates from my left atrium and goes up the carotid artery, and all of a sudden I collapse, and I'm taken into the ITU in Adam Brooks Hospital. I'm unconscious, I am with a bit serious brain dysfunction. I'm not a person. My personhood has just gone by a small microembolism going up my carotid artery. Then I start to recover on the ITU, I get discharged eventually, I become consciously aware, I'm a person again. And so you see the personhood is an extremely fragile concept, and it's totally dependent on contingencies. And at any moment, my personhood may be lost, may be regained, may be lost, and so on. And then, of course, there's the social consequences of this kind of thinking, because inevitably what this kind of thinking does is it divides human society into gradations. So there are people like us who are conscious and choosing. So we're all right. We're safe. We know we exist. But then you've got a whole substrata of people who are human non-persons, fetuses and people babies and people with learning difficulties and people with dementia and people with and there is then this grey penumbra, this borderline zone of people who pop in and out of personhood and so on. So is that the kind of society we want to belong to, which but effectively has a hierarchy of humanness, of human personhood, and divides one another into those different groups? This is not a new question, and in fact the most influential definition comes from the early medieval period. The definition of person was Boethius, who wrote, "A person is an individual substance of a rational nature." Now, that definition has been extraordinarily influential in Western thought. It emphasises individuation, and arguably the individualism which really comes to light in the Enlightenment starts with Boethius. An individual substance, literally cannot be divided. And it emphasises rationality as being the essence of humanity, so that it was on this basis that beings who are not rational were not regarded as persons. Notice also that in this definition, the most fundamental definitions are individual, substance, rational, and nature. And a person is defined on the basis of things which are more fundamental. It's more fundamental to talk about rationality or individuality than it is to talk about personhood. Where does this concept come from? Well, it's interesting because both Latin and Greek have the concept of the word person, but it basically, in Latin it's persona, and in Greek it's prosopon, and it refers to the public face. It's the mask that we present to the world. It's the role that we inhabit. And in fact, it's interesting that in the ancient Greco-Roman world, the idea that there was a person underlying all that was not understood, or certainly was not promoted. So if you were to ask an ancient Greek, yeah, but what's the person really like? That's their face. But what are they really like? They wouldn't know what you were talking about. Because it was the public face was the person. It was the persona. Interestingly, in English, we still have the word persona. What is the persona? It is their social role. It is the face they present. But what happened and it's also interesting is in the Bible, where it says there is no respect of persons with God. I was reading an article by a theologian about persons. He said this verse is rather discouraging for theologians who want to develop a theology of personhood, because it says there is no respect of persons with God. But that should be translated, there is no respect of personae. God isn't interested in our social face, in the mask we inhabit. But elsewhere in the scriptures, the idea of the hypostasis, which was literally the thing which lay beneath, hypostasis, the substance. The Son is the exact representation of God's being, literally hypostasis. And the Cappadocian fathers, the early church fathers, then developed a whole theology based around the persons of the Trinity, the hypostases, the three persons of the Trinity, and said that God's being is actually enshrined in these three persons who are in some sense in communion, literally in ecstasia, in ecstasy. The going out, the ecstasy means literally the going out of the person to another. And so they developed this strange idea of and they use the word perichoresis, which literally means a stately dance, of these three persons of the Trinity giving themselves to each other from eternity past, that the being of God was enshrined in this Trinitarian state. So, personhood in this way of thinking is actually an ontological, foundational concept. You cannot define personhood in terms of rationality or in terms of individuality, because ultimately to be a person is to be like God, and persons are constituted by their relations. their being is derived from the movement of communion, from the freedom to give oneself to the other. So the idea of self-giving love, which the early Christians called agape, they adopted a word of the love that gives, is something that is uniquely a person's. That's what persons do. And to be a person is to participate in some sense in the divine life of the Creator. So this idea of the person then penetrates through Western thinking and Western thought form. So whenever we use the phrase, he is a person, he is not a person, we're actually using a phrase which is a very theologically loaded phrase. It's a phrase which derives ultimately from a very particular understanding of Christian theology and of the understanding of the Trinity. And so the essence of personhood is that it's something that cannot be defined in terms of material. It cannot be defined purely in terms of atoms and in terms of subatomic particles and so on. There is something beyond that which is personhood. And of course this is very relevant in science, which tends to describe everything in terms of fundamental concepts and ultimately matter and energy, and to classify those, is that fundamentally science is blind to the concept of personhood. It isn't a scientific concept, it's a theological concept, or it's a personal concept. And just to try and illustrate this is an illustration I've sometimes used in discussions with atheistic scientists and so on, is you imagine a very senior scientist who's actually a zoologist and who specialises in the classification of plants, and she's working in her laboratory, and one day she receives through the post a single red rose with nothing else. And so instantly she classifies, analyses, orders. She uses all her scientific technique, no doubt chromosomal analysis, PCR and everything else, in order to identify precisely the nature of this plant. Of course, the point is that she's missed the point. Somebody is trying to tell her something, but what they're trying to tell her is not identifiable in scientific terms. It is one person trying to communicate to another person, and that communication is not against science, but it cannot be analysed by science. It's a different order of being. And in the same sense, our understanding of personhood is something that is not defined ultimately by matter and energy. It's defined by relations. We are constituted by our relations. And in some sense, therefore, the whole universe can be seen as a red rose. Somebody is trying to tell us something. If we simply take this red rose and use it to do science on it, we've missed something. There is another message. The universe is not a closed system, but it's a construction, an artifact, which derives ultimately from the mind of God, from a person to people. It's initiated, designed, upheld, and purposive. So whereas Descartes came up with this famous tag, I think, therefore I am, you could argue that in Trinitarian thinking, an alternative would be, you love me, therefore I am. My being, my ontology, is constituted by my relations, both at a human level, but also ultimately by my relationship with God himself. As we've had a debate and discussion already about this enigmatic phrase, what does it mean to be made in God's likeness? What does the Imago Dei actually mean? And I think ultimately it is mysterious, and countless theological tomes have been written on the different possible meanings of this word. But I think there's something very fundamental that you can say, and that is that the concept of Imago Dei, that human beings are in some sense made in God's image, implies that human beings are not self-explanatory. That ultimately, however much you analyse the nature of what it means to be a human being, from scientific terms, you will never understand, ultimately, our meaning, because we derive our meaning from outside ourselves. We derive our meaning, ultimately, from the being and nature of God himself. And just an analogy which I've previously used, you imagine some super intelligent being on the Andromeda galaxy, and they're receiving through their antennae some strange distorted image. And you can imagine these super intelligent beings poring over precisely the relationships, the precise absorption characteristics of each pixel, how they relate to the other pixels and so on. They'll never understand what they are looking at until they realise that actually it's a map, it's the London Underground map, and that those precise collection of the reason that the orientation and the precise collection of why they are is because they reflect another kind of being entirely. They reflect these strange metal things that go chuntering through tubes in a particular part of the planet. So the two things which look completely different, a map with a collection of pixels and strange lines, and these metal objects which go chuntering through tubes, have a hidden connection. One is a representation, a map of the other. And in the same way, it seems to me, that the concept of the Imago Dei is that in some sense, we're simply carbon-based life forms, like every other carbon-based life forms, but we alone map onto something else, which is the being and nature of God himself. And our relationality, our ability to be constituted by our relations, is therefore of significance in the God that we represent, the God that we image. So human beings are not self-explanatory. The structure of our humanity, the values and purposes of human life only make sense in the light of our creation in God's image. And this way of thinking, therefore, argues that our dignity and significance come not from our functionality, from our particular abilities, but from the stuff of our being, from our godlikeness, from our representational nature. At the same time, the early chapters of Genesis stress that we're made out of dust, we're made out of the same stuff as everything else, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised that human beings, as carbon-based life forms, share the same limitations and contingencies of the physical universe, and we're physical, dependent, frail and vulnerable beings, embodied but free. And so each one of us comes into the world utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. So you came into this world utterly, totally dependent. Then you go through a phase of your life when other people depend on you. I'm still going through that phase, even in my emeritus status. We have 3 boys who are now grown up, but just yesterday the phone rings, Dad, can you transfer some money into my account, Dad? So I still have beings who are dependent on me. But then most of us are going to end our lives utterly and totally dependent on the love and care of others. And that's not some terrible evil. No, it actually comes from the nature of who we are, the way we are designed and made to be, that we are dependent, vulnerable and fragile as part of our humanity. And this was brought home to me very forcefully some years ago when my mother was transformed from being a very intelligent, vivacious lady into somebody who was affected by dementia and became utterly and totally dependent. And in the end, she was hallucinating, she was doubly incontinent, she could do nothing for herself, she was having 24-hour nursing care, and I was being asked, I was visiting her, and somebody thrust a yogurt pot and a teaspoon into my hand, and I'm trying to feed her, and I'm saying, open your mouth, here it comes, and then I suddenly have a flashback, because this is precisely what she used to do for me, and now the tables are turned, and yet I remember thinking at the time, perhaps this is the way it was meant to be. I'm learning more of what it means to be a son, and she's learning more of what it means to be a mother. So dependence is part of our human story. And the quest for independence, the quest to be autonomous, is actually a quest to transcend our own humanity. It's to become something other than human, other than the way we're meant to be. And this lovely verse in the Psalms, as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. He knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. So our dust-like origins is something that our Creator does not forget. He has compassion on us. Dependence is not an alien, subhuman, undignified condition. It's part of the narrative of every human life. Mylander says, we're dependent beings, and to think otherwise, to make independence our project, however sincere, is to live a lie, which is to fly in the face of reality. And so this modern quest that we saw in the euthanasia movement for independence is ultimately to live a lie. Our human dignity comes not from our function, but from the stuff of our being. It is intrinsic. At least this is what it is argued from this kind of Trinitarian thinking. And also, both in biblical thinking, but also in modern population genetics, what's interesting is the way that we are so closely related to one another. As a human family, we have common ancestors, we are part of a single human family. So, for instance, that suggests that as you turn to the left and the right, as you sit there, you're looking at a distant relative. Every single person in this room is related, and in theory, if we looked into our DNA, we could work out the relationships. So, despite the superficial differences, we share this sense of being interrelated. And we're called to treat even the stranger and the immigrant with gentleness, with respect and love. Why? Because they are family. And within this way of thinking, therefore, I often hear older people, including religious and Christian old people who ought to know better, say something like, I just don't want to be a burden to anybody. I'm very happy to care for other people, but I don't want to be a burden. But actually, that way of thinking is not at all consistent with our understanding of our interdependence. In fact, you could argue that we're designed to be a burden. I'm designed to be a burden to you, and you are designed to be a burden to me. And the life of a family is one of mutual burdensomeness. That's the way it was meant to be. So again, to somehow deny our mutual dependence is to do something against our own humanity. This is the kind of retrospective view which Gareth was talking about. Just suppose this is what you look like when you were born. This is what you look like at 28 weeks, three-dimensional ultrasound. This is what you look like at 18 weeks. This is what you look like at 6 weeks. This is what you look like at 3 weeks. This is what you look like at 3 days. If that's exactly what you did look like, is there any point as you look back in your own history at which you can say, that is not me? And I don't think there is any point. As we go back in our own history, then it doesn't seem there's any point at which you can reliably say, that is not me. And of course, that begs the question, as we look prospectively, about the point at which there is a being who has an individual and personal identity. I think also that it's surely not an accident that the way we make babies is by making love. That in fact, every baby is a physical incarnation of the unique love between two unique individuals. And so as we look at our children, and we see this bizarre combination of John and Celia, my wife, and now the John and Celia used to be an invisible, mystical union with our love when we met one another, and it was a unique love. And then this invisible, mystical union has somehow turned and become incarnate as a physical baby. So in the very structure of the DNA of our children is the unique combination of John and Celia. And what's more, if they go on and have children of their own, the unique combination of John and Celia will carry on down in the human gene pool. Long after John and Celia are dead and gone, their unique combination will go on down into the human gene pool. In other words, making love and making babies belongs together. And maybe from that perspective, you could say that DNA is a mechanism by which the unique love between a man and a woman is turned into a baby. And of course that suggests, therefore, that once you use gamete donation to create a baby that in some sense is not an incarnation of love, but which is created, and of course rape as well, other ways of making babies that are not incarnations of a unique love, then become something which offend against this fundamental nature of our humanity, the gift we have of begetting babies. And in some theologians, like Oliver O'Donovan, have used this difference between creation. When we create something, it comes from our will and from our mind. But that which we beget comes as a gift from our being and is equal in status and dignity to ourselves. We care for, nurture and educate our children, but we cannot control or manipulate them. I'm running out of time and I'm not going to be able to give great detail, but I just want to throw some headlines, and then I'm very happy to talk in more detail in the Q&A and in the panel discussion later this evening. It seems to me that when we think about the developing human in the uterus, there are two theological themes. Again, I'm thinking from a particularly Christian perspective here, but they're theological themes you can find in the other Abrahamic religions. One is the theme of the already and the not yet. So the embryo is in the process of becoming what it already is. It's an embryonic human. Notice how even language, the language we use, determines the way, the morality we think. It's one of the curious things about, you see this in moral philosophy repeatedly, that language is highly influential in determining morality. And therefore, choosing the language you use was already framing your moral decision making. So for instance, if you talk about the human embryo, embryo is the noun, human is the adjective. So there are chimpanzee embryos, and there are fruit fly embryos, and there are chicken embryos, and there are human embryos, and guess what? They're all exactly the same. They're embryos. They're all got a bilipid membrane and a nucleus and cytoplasm and so on. Of course, that's the perspective of the embryologist who says, what's the big deal? It's a human embryo, it's a chicken embryo, it's a fruit fly embryo, what's the difference? But of course you can turn the language round and you can say there are adult humans, there are infantile humans, there are geriatric humans, there are fetal humans, and there are embryonic humans. And guess what? They're all human beings on a human narrative, or somewhere on the human narrative. That immediately changes the same. You see how the same being suddenly has a different understanding. And this, of course, is a problem because language is not neutral, therefore. It's almost impossible to find language in these debates which is neutral. As soon as you select language, you're already pushing towards a particular moral analysis. So thinking like this, the embryo is in the process of becoming what it already is, a human being. But of course recognising that many embryos fail to make that journey, and at least 50%, if not 70% or more, fail to make the journey of becoming what they already are. So we hold together the already and the not yet. We also hold together the physical and the immaterial. So at the one time, at one level, the embryo is merely a cell, and one cell click, two cells click, four cells click, 8 cells. It's just simply cellular machinery going through the process. But at the same time, taking this theological personhood perspective, God is calling into existence a unique being, who from nowhere, a being into whom he knows and loves and has a name, and who is destined for relationship. Now, how can those two things both be true at the same time? And the honest answer is I haven't a clue. But I know they're both true. And therefore what I have to hold together is I have to hold together the physical and the immaterial. And in fact, we often find in Orthodox Christian theology that those two are often held together. So we see this in Christology, in our understanding of Christ. We see it in the doctrine of Scripture and doctrine of history and so on, that the physical and the immaterial are held together in a way which we don't fully understand. And it seems to me we should do the same with a developing human being. We hold together the physical and the immaterial. But ultimately, the human embryo is sui generis. It is not a collection of cells, and nor it is an unborn baby. It is a unique being, a human being on the way. And Oliver Donovan has argued that we cannot expect biology to reveal the point at which God's covenant commitment to an individual starts. In other words, to use an electron microscope to see if a person is there is a category mistake. You don't find persons through science. You find persons through relationship, through interaction, through commitment, through covenant. And therefore, what Donovan argues is that we should reach out to this being in the womb with interaction and commitment in the hope that we will discover whether there's a person there. That person may not. We may as we reach out to this being, that being may become revealed that there is no person there. But our commitment is to reach out to this being in the hope that their personhood will become apparent. And I think within this way of thinking, it could also be argued that the embryo is already in relation from the moment of its conception. So this being already has a mother and a father. Even though the mother doesn't know that the embryo exists, in some sense she has already become a mother, because that being, and therefore her own personhood has changed. It is locked in a network of human relationships. It has a mummy and a daddy, it has grandparents, it has a family structure. It is already within the human family. It is constituted by its relations. It's the process of becoming what it already is. And then just finally, the extraordinary, scandalous thing which historic Christianity claims is that God himself becomes one of these beings. So that God enters into the human narrative, and he himself makes himself dependent, fragile, vulnerable. He becomes subject to the contingencies of being a carbon-based life form, and he requires to be fed. He makes himself dependent, and yet what Christian theology teaches is at the very moment that he is being fed or having his bottom wiped in Bethlehem, he is upholding the universe by the word of his power. How does that work? But his unique dignity and status is not impaired by the fact he's having his bottom wiped. So please remember that. If you end up in a hospital and you have to have your bottom wiped and you become utterly and totally dependent, your unique status, your unique dignity as a person known and loved is in no way impaired by dependence. Dependence does not touch our uniqueness as a human being. I'm going to stop there, and I'm very happy to discuss about more practical applications and how to apply this kind of theology in practice. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Over to you for questions. Please, Aaron. Yeah.
Thank you for a great talk. Just a quick question about how practical your position is and how universal it is. You mentioned that it costs quite a lot of money to sustain babies in ICU. How do we address this in cases where, even within the UK, families cannot afford to maintain people with this medical condition, economically?
Thanks, Jim. I'm glad to say that in the UK, this is a huge problem worldwide, and in fact I have many colleagues who work in different health systems, and I was talking to my equivalent who worked in New York, and he told me of the case of a baby who was born in the tenement blocks in New York, very premature baby, who spent 3 months on the neonatal intensive care unit, who survives, is discharged from hospital, goes back to the tenement block, where the baby's nose is bitten off by a rat. And so it just makes the contrast between the fact that within the high-tech medical environment it's possible to give sophisticated care, but the care that's available within the community is often extremely lacking. I think, it's a very real and challenging issue. Fortunately in the UK, with the welfare state, that there is basic provision for all parents, and so even for parents who are effectively destitute, they will receive care and extra financial and other social support for the baby once the baby is discharged from hospital. I know that in many other countries that's not the case, and you often do get this extraordinary mismatch between the high-tech care given in hospital. So, I think my position would be, yes, these are really important questions, but it doesn't seem to me that because we have real difficulty caring for babies in the community, therefore we shouldn't bother to care for them in the hospital. I don't see the logic of that. I think it means we have to work harder to try to ensure that all babies receive the right kind of care when they go home, and that they are valued as being, that a newborn baby is valued as being a member of the community. And the right kind of resources. So as a paediatrician, I feel that our health resources are very much orientated towards older people because older people are voters in our democratic society. Newborn babies have no vote, they have no voice, they have nobody to argue the case for them, whereas the older people, they call it the grey voter, is a very powerful voice in our society. So part of our job, I feel, as paediatricians, as those caring for newborn babies, is to be a voice for the voiceless and to stand up for those who are weak and not able to stand up for themselves.
Follow up, please. My question was more, as you presented it and starting to use biblical text, are you in danger of developing a theological doctrine of medical ethics that is basically not sustainable for a general public across the world?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it's. I would say yes, I am developing a theological doctrine, but I'm not danger, because actually the whole of medical ethics has been dominated by theology right from its very start. I mean, as I tried to point out, all the arguments about personhood is a theological argument. I'm simply clarifying what, to many people, they fail to recognise, which is that Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic faith reasoning about humanity has profoundly influenced the whole of our medical care systems for 2,000 years, and the whole of our thinking about persons. Now, the question is how you argue it. Now, of course, if I was presenting this talk for a group of neonatologists or a group of paediatricians, I would frame it somewhat differently. I would still include some of the theological element, but I would then use arguments to say why this works now. And it seems to me there are three kinds of arguments that you can use in the public domain. The first argument is really philosophical arguments based on truth claims. In other words, that to argue on the nature of reality. So, for instance, when I argue that making love and making babies belongs together, I'm making a truth claim about the nature of reality, which can be contested, but nonetheless, I'm arguing making truth claims. But truth claims are often highly contested in secular society, and often they end up circular. So, it's true for you and it's not true for me, and what is truth anyway, and etc., etc. But there are two other groups of arguments that we can use. The second group of arguments is that it works. There is empirical evidence that if you follow this kind of reasoning, it has positive outcomes. And actually, there is lots and lots of empirical evidence showing that if you follow these kind of ethical principles, it leads to greater human happiness, greater satisfaction with life, greater life expectation, improved relationships, etc., etc. So actually there's quite a lot of empirical evidence showing that if you follow Judeo-Christian principles, it has positive health benefits. In fact, it saves money. At this point, the economists get interested. Oh, you mean you can actually reduce healthcare costs? Yes, you can, by following these particular principles. Number three, which philosophically is the weakest line of argument, but my experience, having been involved in quite a lot of debates in public arenas and so on, is that it's the line of argument has the greatest impact, and that is that it matches with human intuitions. That if you follow this line of reasoning, it matches with the deepest human intuitions of most people in our society. And so, for instance, what I would sometimes construct is a sort of, I would say, here are two alternative health systems. Here's a health system developed on the ideals of Peter Singer, where individual autonomy, choice, is absolutely central, and that people are divided into whether or not they can choose or not, and everything is done according to this principle. And here is a health system which is based on Judeo-Christian principles, where all human beings are regarded as being special and unique and are valued, and the weak are protected and defended and treated with respect. Now, when you are sick and admitted to hospital, which hospital would you prefer to be admitted to? Or even more telling, when your mother is admitted incontinent, confused and demented to hospital, which hospital would you prefer to be admitted to? And the interesting thing is, the number of people who say, well, intellectually and philosophically, I would say that this was definitely a logical way to, but actually, I'd much prefer to go to that hospital, please.
Please, yes.
It's interesting because I heard one person talk about the danger of having doctors at all involved in euthanasia. That the whole Hippocratic Oath grew up in Greece around the concept that when you hired a doctor, you know, in that culture, you didn't know if somebody else had hired that doctor and paid them more money to kill you than you were paying them to heal you. And so the Hippocratic Oath grew out of that whole concept, and the argument goes it would be better to just train a certain grouping of people, perhaps people from the military, to do the euthanizing, because that's more in their line of work than it is in the line of work of doctors. And as a physician, I would feel much more comfortable with that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I think there's very good historical evidence. That's precisely how the Hippocratic band developed, because they took this binding oath to be only to heal and not to harm, unlike all the other practitioners at the time. And that was then, that Hippocratic tradition was then adopted by the early Christian church, and so then it becomes the early Christian church, actually, which preserves this little esoteric sect of Hippocrates. So the very reason that we've ever heard of Hippocrates is actually largely because of the Christian church, who adopted and Christianized Hippocratism. And I think you're absolutely right. But of course, the population as a whole are horrified by the idea of the Royal College of Euthanasiologists. And they want the doctor to do. Why? Because they trust the doctor.
And they don't understand what they're sacrificing when they want the doctor to do this.
Yes, I agree.
And I think that media could educate them, though, like in the whole euthanasia debate.
Yeah.
I think it's important for the general public to be educated on what they lose.
Yeah. The problem is the media is not neutral. The media has an agenda, certainly in the UK. And talking to people off record, they say, we know it's going to happen. We know it's going to be legalised. It's a historical inevitability. It might happen this year, it might happen next year, it might happen in 5 years' time. We're on the side of the winners.
It's happened in my province in Canada now, and so it's going to sweep across Canada. It's just in the last month or so.
Please, yes.
No, thank you very much for your talk. I'd like just to address the problems of based on historical aspects to make conclusions about personhood. For instance, you mentioned about the last debates in the 90s about cancer. Okay, we have to write because we are suffering, but nowadays cancer is a chronic disease, and now the debate is fighting for life. We struggle for life, and people are involved in this. Nowadays, the main discussion about degenerative disease, but medicine is progressing, and I do hope that many efforts have been applied to solve this degenerative disease, and this will change as well. Yeah. So the problem of the right of deciding in terms of it's too fragile if you take into consideration the historical movement and also how the society deal with different in the past plagues, skin problems, nowadays social degenerative disease. But we are changing, and we face changes in the way that society, medicine, technology deal with health problems.
Yes. No, I think, thanks very much, I agree with that, and therefore, because of the development of technology, one can't predict what future dilemmas are going to be. It's part of the problem of being involved in medical ethics. You just think you've got your head around something, and you turn on the television and they say, scientists today announcing, and well, I'm back to the drawing board. So, I think you're right. Having said that, someone like Tony Nicholson, with his locked-in syndrome, would say, well, of course it's true that in 10 years' time there might be developed a treatment for locked-in syndrome. It doesn't help me now. I have a problem here and now. We need to find a response here and now. And so we can't avoid wrestling with these really painful and difficult issues just because we hope that in the future things will change.
At the back, please. Excuse me. Yes.
Thank you. Could I ask you to enlarge a bit more on the issue of rape, taking into account that, conception is not It's not a necessary consequence of rape.
Mm.
But where it can be,
Mm-hmm.
okay, there's a bond between the mother and the fetus, but the mother doesn't want the fetus. She never asked for the fetus. The very way in which it was brought about was utterly an invasion of her own personality, personhood.
Mm.
Sure.
Yeah, well, it's something certainly I've come across as painful reality, and actually it's very close to home. My wife runs a charity centre in North London where they offer non-directive counselling to women who have a crisis pregnancy, and she has had several women who've become pregnant through rape, and it's an agonising and terrible dilemma. In these situations, often women feel profoundly humiliated, violated, and sometimes a sense of repulsion towards the fact that the man who did this and the fact they become pregnant. Having said that, the idea that simply by doing an abortion we solve the problem, it's all gone, start again, clean slate, of course, is not the case. People live with these kind of realities for the rest of their lives. And for some women, and I don't say for all, but for some women, what my wife would say is that the very abortion itself feels like another violation. It's a violation of their own motherhood. And she is involved in counselling women sometimes who've had an abortion. Sometimes they've been forced by a partner or by parents to have an abortion years previously. And 10, 20 years later, they are still reliving the event. They're having flashbacks, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, and deep feelings of shame. So I think in the end, it's a appalling personal dilemma, which nobody, pray God it doesn't happen to anybody in this room or to anybody we know. What I do know is that there are the most extraordinary stories of redemption of women who have suffered abortion. If you're interested in this, there's a book called Startling Beauty, and the author's name is Heather Gemmon, and she was an American Christian lady living in a very nice middle-class white suburban area who was raped by a black intruder. She agonises about the whole thing. She discovers she's pregnant. She's talked to the pastor. She takes the morning after pill. She's advised to have an abortion. She agonises. It's a very shocking but very well written book, and it's just stream of consciousness stuff. Eventually she decides to keep the pregnancy, and this mixed race child is born. She then has to suffer all the comments as she takes this child around her white suburban neighbourhood, and the comments, you must have been playing away from home, dear, and all those kind of comments. And yet she ends the book by saying rape is ugly, rape is evil, rape is twisted, rape is destructive, and yet I look in the face of a child who is so unwanted and I see a startling beauty. And my wife has been involved with at least one, probably two cases like that also. And in fact, we can think of one child who's actually become a very close friend of our family, who was conceived through rape. And this woman has now made a life as a single mother, caring for this child, who is the light of her life. And what my wife comments is that whereas so many people who've had an abortion carry a deep burden of shame, a hidden secret they can't tell anyone, if the woman can find it in herself to carry on the pregnancy, she actually finds something. This girl that I'm thinking of has a great sense of pride that I've made it. I'm a mother, and look at my child. And yes, I deeply wish that it had never happened, but it is possible for good to come out of evil. So these are deeply painful, and I'm certainly not saying that in every case that happens or would happen, but I think it is possible in an extraordinary way for good to come out of evil. The same kind of thing, I've seen the same kind of thing when in babies born with very severe learning disabilities or genetic malformations. I think of a baby born with trisomy 18. In fact, I have pictures to show you, but I ran out of time. With Edwards syndrome, who, tiny little baby, who only survived a few months, and who certainly from a philosophical point of view, the philosophers would say this was a life not worth living, this was a life of no consequence, of no significance. And yet, this little baby Christopher became like a mini celebrity in the community, where I was, particularly in the Christian community, who was much loved and cuddled. And when he died, about 400 people came to the funeral to pay tribute to this pathetic, deformed, and apparently meaningless little life. So I think that in the strange business of humanity, it isn't always obvious that the easy solution, the obvious solution, is necessarily the right one.
Yeah. Please, yes.
Thank you. I think what you referred to, and I think it's so interesting, is that in life we get the spiritual override. And I think it actually comes from a slightly different theological point of view, in that you can look at mankind as an Adamic race, or you can take the Christ-like view. You've got to separate the Jesus from the Christ. And basically, as I see it, my sense of theological sense of it is that it's the Christ that expresses what God is. It's the direct expression of God's qualities. It's Philip saying to Jesus, "Show us the Father,"
Yeah.
and Jesus says, "I'm showing you the Father," but in a spiritual context. And as I see it, the problem we get into is in some way or another we have tried to equate a human form and a physical body with a spiritual activity. And the best way I can explain it, I have a quite good friend who was in a car accident that left her as a paraplegic. And for 18 months she prayed about the situation. And she said that the day she understood that her joy, that's to say her spiritual qualities, her joy, her happiness, her love did not depend on a physical body, she got the use of that body back.
Right.
And to my sense of things, if we put that into the debate about the function of the human body, I like to look at it as a sort of passport. It tells us who we are, but it doesn't tell us what we are. It doesn't in spiritual terms. And I think if we look at it like that, then the whole debate of where God enters into the equation becomes a lot easier to answer.
Well, thanks very much. That's really fascinating. I mean, there are very deep philosophical and theological issues here, of course, and they go back a long way. And one of the big debates that's been in Christianity right from the earliest stages is how to understand the physical versus the spiritual. And of course, at various times, Christianity has moved in a direction which is sometimes called Docetism or Gnosticism, where basically the only thing that matters is the spiritual. The body is simply a container, and really we should just concentrate on the spiritual side. But there has been always a counter move saying you can't go too far in that direction, because the whole essence of the Jesus who reveals God is that he is a physical, recognizable human being, and that he's called the second Adam, and that when he is raised from the dead, he is a physical, recognizable, touchable human being with scars, and the grave was empty. So the physical atoms of which his body was composed, in some sense, are incorporated into the resurrection body. So that's why I find that holding them both together, saying the physical and the immaterial, we must lock them together. Yes, they can both be, you can be profoundly damaged physically and retain your immateriality, your spirituality. But that doesn't mean that the physical is of no consequence. Otherwise, you could argue, what on earth am I wasting my time as a doctor? I mean, let's just concentrate on spirit. So, I think the fact that we are embodied as human beings, we are carbon-based life forms, is part of the plan, and we never sort of get beyond our carbon-based nature. It will always be part of the plan. I mean, of course, the whole question about life after death and resurrection bodies, and that's a whole other debate. But I mean, I certainly, an anecdote comes to mind of a friend of mine who watched her father, who'd had a very strong Christian faith, and who'd particularly been a man who prayed a great deal. And then she'd watched him decline into Alzheimer's disease, and he deteriorated, and his speech become more and more fragmentary, and eventually he'd become completely mute. And he would sit in his sofa at home. She was caring for him, and sometimes he wouldn't speak from one week to the next. And they were watching television. He was sitting there, and the television was on, and it was Songs of Praise, which is a well-known religious program in the UK. And it so happened that the program was about prayer. And my friend, his daughter, on an impulse, said to him, "Do you still pray, Dad?" And there was a pause, and then to her amazement, he said, "Yes." And he hadn't spoken for what we thought to. And she said, "What do you say to God when you pray?" And there was this long pause, and he said, "I say, hello." And that was it. But I thought that was actually quite profound. I mean, what more do you need to say?
Right, so Bill, yeah. So,
thanks for your talk. I've been sitting here musing about your two hospital scenario and the Christian principles you...
Bill, could you stand up because of the camera? I'm sorry. Yeah,
I've
thank you
been
very much.
musing about the two hospital scenario, one based on Christian principles of embracing dependency and reaching out in hope to dependent beings in hope and love. And I'm wondering in that hospital what would happen if I came in. I've been in a terrible automobile accident. After several weeks, I had a flat EEG. It's not an ambiguous case. It's not a close call. I've had a pre-existing directive in my will that I don't want to continue to exist under those kinds of circumstances. I don't want to sit there force-fed and breathing through a respirator. My family's all in agreement with it. Am I allowed in that hospital, my family allowed to withdraw life support, or is the normative principle there that this is a dependent being? Dependency is a normal part of the human experience, and we should be reaching out in love and hope to that being there in bed, in the hopes of finding some response.
Right.
Under that, in your hospital.
I don't understand that. And my answer is yes, of course. We would. I try to practice medicine according to Christian principles, and on numerous occasions, I have taken the decision with parents to withdraw life support in newborn babies because I thought it was the right thing to do, and because I thought it was love. Because reaching out to this baby with love was to actually allow them to die. So the interesting thing is, I think in Christian thinking, death has this strange ambiguity. Death is both an enemy to be fought against, but it is also a gateway into another existence, into a new kind of life. And therefore, death can be turned from being an enemy into a strange kind of healing, into what C.S. Lewis calls a severe mercy. And so I think great evil is done by doctors, some of them religious, some of them not, some of them atheistic, who practice a sort of vitalism where the most important thing is to carry on treatment to the bitter end, to keep the heart beating as long as possible. So I regard withdrawal of life support and withdrawal of invasive treatment as being an appropriate thing where it is futile or burdensome. But of course, in that situation, the cause of death is not switching off the ventilator. the cause of death, the underlying biological cause of death, is whatever has wrecked the lungs, or wrecked the brain, or wrecked... Now, I think there is a fundamental difference between that and me coming along and positively introducing death into the situation. So, in the first situation, when I switch off the ventilator, the way I think of it is that death is already there. Death has entered this room, death has entered this cot, and we are desperately holding it away with all our machinery and technology, and what we do at one point is we take away our hands and we allow death to occur. It's completely different for me to walk into this room where death is not and take death out of my pocket and inject it.
Sure.
And so, although that difference is derided by Peter Singer as a utilitarian, as a consequentialist, he says there's no difference. You walked into the room, the patient was alive, you do something, you walk out, the patient is dead. What's the difference? But I think most of us intuitively see there is a difference. There is a difference between allowing death, which is already there, to occur, versus introducing death. And I personally feel that as we're going right back to the origin of Hippocrates, it is not my job as a doctor to introduce death.
Are you actually allowed to talk about Christianity within your hospital?
It's a very good question. And the short answer is we were, but the rules are changing.
Everything's terribly politically
It's
correct.
become incredibly politically correct, and it's dramatic how it's changed. So 10 years ago, I would not have hesitated to have this kind of conversation. Of course, I would have it sensitively, and I would be, at times, be quite open talking about my Christian faith, saying we'd like to pray for your child, and so on. Now, I have to be really careful, because I could find myself in front of the General Medical Council and splashed all over the newspapers, and some of my colleagues have been struck off for having these kind of conversations.
No.
And there is a very aggressive sort of secularism afoot, saying that doctors should just concentrate on twiddling knobs and talking about plasma sodiums,
That's terrible.
and that they should leave any wider discussion with that humanity out. So, but it's being fought back, and we are fighting strongly back. We're saying that we want to practice holistic medicine, which means we treat the whole patient, and that includes their plasma sodium, but it also includes their relationships, and it includes their existential and spiritual aspects. And actually, most patients want holistic medicine. They don't want a doctor who can only talk about plasma sodium. They want a doctor who actually treats me like a human being.
Well, I think that is a very good note on which to finish this session. It's been a fantastic morning. Thank you, John, very much indeed.